There is a pattern in the human mind that is so persistent, so invisible, and yet so defining, that it quietly shapes the story of who you believe you are. You have lived with it since childhood, and you will carry it into every decision, every memory, every perception of yourself and others. This is what psychologists call negativity bias. It is the silent force that makes you remember the insult, but forget the compliment, that keeps the one moment of failure playing endlessly in your mind, while all the moments of success dissolve into the background. When I speak of this, I do not speak from a place of judgment. I speak from the understanding that every human brain is wired for this, mine included. We are not dealing with a flaw in character or an individual weakness. We are speaking about a system deeply rooted in human psychology and in what some call dark psychology, the study of the hidden, often uncomfortable truths of the mind's behavior. It is a truth that can be unsettling because it strips away the illusion of neutrality in our perception. The mind is not an even balance between the good and the bad. It is a tilted scale, and that tilt is not accidental. Picture this. You walk into a meeting, you deliver your ideas, and most people nod with interest. Some even smile, but one person, just one, makes a dismissive remark. Hours later, you are not thinking about the nods or the smile. You are replaying that single remark, dissecting it, wondering why it was said, what it means, and what others thought of it. Days later, the same thought resurfaces without warning, as if your mind has bookmarked it, ready to reopen the wound without your permission. You can feel the tension again, almost as if the event is happening in the present. This is not because you choose to suffer. It is because the mind records and prioritizes negative information with far greater weight than positive information. Neuroscience shows us that the amygdala, the part of the brain responsible for detecting threat and processing fear, responds more intensely to negative stimuli. That intensity feeds into memory consolidation, meaning that a negative experience is stored more vividly and retrieved more easily than a positive one. Positive events may fade into a soft recollection, but negative events can be recalled with a sharpness that cuts through time. In dark psychology, this tendency is not seen as an innocent byproduct of survival, but as a core mechanism that can be exploited. If the mind holds on to the worst so readily, it means that influence can be achieved, not by giving you hope, but by instilling fear, doubt, or shame. This is why political campaigns, media outlets, and even interpersonal manipulators so often focus on negative narratives. They know that the negative sticks. You might think that awareness alone should be enough to weaken this grip. If you can see the bias, perhaps you can correct it. But in practice, it is not so simple. Awareness of negativity bias is like knowing a storm is coming, but having no shelter to avoid its impact. You still feel the force. You still find your thoughts pull toward what went wrong, what could go wrong, or what has hurt you before. The bias does not simply fade when confronted with logic. It runs deeper into the architecture of how your mind organizes and interprets experience. Consider the imbalance this creates over time. If you live 30 years with a mind that catalogues your failures, betrayals, and humiliations in vivid detail, while recording your achievements and joys as faint impressions, then your sense of self will be built disproportionately on what is worst in your history. You will know your faults intimately, but struggle to remember your strength. You will believe you are seeing the truth, when in reality you are seeing only the truth. The bias allows you to keep. This is not only a personal phenomenon. Societies are built on collective memory, and collective memory is also subject to negativity bias. Wars, disasters, crimes, and scandals dominate historical narratives, while eras of peace, cooperation, and progress fade in significance. The result is a worldview where danger feels constant, where safety feels temporary, and where trust is fragile. We can tell ourselves that we are rational beings, capable of weighing the good against the bad. But the truth, supported by decades of psychological research, is that the mind's weighting system is not balanced. It is designed to keep the bad in clear focus, not as a choice, but as a default. That design keeps you alert, keeps you cautious, and keeps you alive. but it also keeps you from fully living without the shadow of what has hurt you before. The most unsettling reality is this: the bias is not an error to be corrected, but a survival strategy your mind refuses to abandon, even when it costs you peace. For most of your life, you have been told a simple story about why you remember the bad more than the good. The story goes like this: bad experiences hurt more, so they stay longer in your mind. They are heavier, so they leave a deeper mark. It feels logical, even comforting in a way, because it suggests that your mind is only protecting you from repeating the same mistakes or walking into the same danger. That belief has been passed through conversation, through culture, and through education until it feels like an unquestionable truth. But in the field of psychology, especially in the study of negativity bias within the realm of dark psychology, this is not the full truth. It is at best a surface explanation, and at worst a comforting illusion. The mind does not hold on to the worst only because of pain. It holds on to the worst because it is wired to use those moments as the foundation for your future thoughts, actions, and even your identity. The pain is just the signal that secures the memory. The real work happens after, in how the memory reshapes your mental map of the world. Think of how you recall a dangerous street corner, a confrontation with a friend, or an embarrassing moment in public. You do not simply remember them as isolated events. You remember them as warnings, as lessons that change how you behave in similar situations. In the process, those memories become part of the rules your mind quietly writes for you. These are rules you did not consciously agree to, but follow all the same. Over time, these rules can extend far beyond their original context. A betrayal by one person can lead you to distrust many. A failure in one task can make you hesitant in unrelated challenges. The mind does not differentiate between what is relevant today and what belonged to the past. If it is marked as danger once, it can be carried forward indefinitely. When I work with people who struggle under the weight of their own history, I see the same pattern. They believe they are remembering because the events were simply too significant to forget. But in truth, the mind is rehearsing the memory, refining it, keeping it sharp, not because it is trying to hurt them, but because it is trying to prevent harm in the future. This is where the dark side of the mechanism shows itself. The same system that once helped our ancestors avoid predators can, in a modern environment, lead us to avoid opportunities, relationships, and risks that could enrich our lives. The lie we have lived with is that this is simply about emotional intensity. If that were true, then moments of great joy, such as the birth of a child, a personal victory, or a deep connection with another person, would stay as sharp as the moments of fear and shame. But they rarely do. Positive experiences do not demand the same mental rehearsal. They do not create the same state of vigilance. Your brain does not treat them as tools for survival. It treats them as pleasant but non-essential details. In dark psychology, this is where influence becomes possible. If a person, a group, or a system can create negative emotional experiences in you, they can shape the way you see reality far more effectively than by creating positive ones. This is why fear-based messages spread faster, last longer, and influence behavior more strongly than encouragement or hope. People are not driven by optimism as much as they are driven by the need to avoid pain. The deeper truth, the one that is harder to accept, is that this bias does not belong to you alone. It is part of the shared human condition. Every one of us has a mind that filters reality through a lens that gives priority to the worst. This is not a flaw to be ashamed of, but it is a vulnerability to be aware of. Because when you know that your mind will keep certain moments alive far beyond their usefulness, you can begin to see how your thoughts may not be giving you an accurate picture of the present. Yet, even knowing this, there is a resistance to changing it. Many people cling to the lie because the alternative is unsettling. If you accept that your mind is designed to keep you focused on what harms you, then you must also accept that your sense of self, your worldview, and your choices are built on a foundation that is tilted by design. You must confront the possibility that you are not as free in your thinking as you believe. The uncomfortable fact is this: The mind's devotion to negative memory is not an accident, not a misunderstanding, and not just about pain. It is a strategy so deeply rooted that it can shape the course of a life without the person ever realizing it. If we strip away the layers of modern life and look at the human brain through the lens of history, we see something remarkable. The architecture of the mind that you carry today was not built for the world you live in now. It was built for survival in an environment filled with threats, scarcity, and uncertainty. The human nervous system, the way it processes and stores information, is the product of countless generations who lived with constant danger. This history explains why negativity bias is not a glitch, but a deeply ingrained blueprint. From the earliest days of our species, those who noticed danger faster and remembered it longer had a better chance of survival. If one person forgot the rustle in the grass that signaled a predator, they might not live to pass on their genes. But the person who felt the fear remembered it vividly and stayed alert whenever they heard a similar sound was far more likely to survive. Over many generations, this tendency became hardwired. It was not just about fear in the moment. It was about preserving the fear in memory so it could guide future behavior. The brain is not symmetrical in how it responds to different types of stimuli. Modern neuroscience shows that negative events trigger stronger and more prolonged activity in the amygdala than positive events do. The amygdala plays a critical role in emotional processing, especially in the detection of threats. When it activates, it sends signals that influence the hippocampus, the part of the brain that consolidates memories. This is why a moment of danger can become etched into memory with such clarity, while a moment of happiness might fade without detail. The brain is essentially telling itself, this is important for survival, keep it close. This biological weighting system worked extremely well in environments where a missed threat could mean death. It helped early humans navigate a world of predators, hostile environments, and uncertain food sources. But in the modern world, where physical threats are less common and dangers are often social or psychological in nature, this same system can cause harm. Your mind reacts to a critical comment, a job rejection, or a public mistake with a level of attention and memory retention, similar to what it would give a life or death threat. The scale of the danger has changed, but the brain's prioritization has not. In dark psychology, this is understood as a point of influence. If the mind naturally prioritizes the negative, then those who wish to control perception can focus on creating or highlighting negative stimuli to shape thought and behavior. This is why fear-based political messages, alarming news headlines, and emotionally charged criticisms tend to dominate public attention. The survival blueprint of the brain makes such messages feel urgent, important, and unforgettable, even when they are not directly relevant to your immediate safety. This is not only about fear, it is also about the way the brain anticipates the future. When you recall a negative event, your brain is not only replaying it, it is simulating possible future threats based on it. This simulation process can lead to a constant state of vigilance, even in safe environments. It is as if your brain is running silent background programs, scanning for any similarity between the present and the past danger it has stored. The cost of this vigilance is high. It drains mental energy, influences mood, and narrows the scope of experiences you are willing to risk. The survival blueprint, in its original form, was about keeping the body alive. In its modern form, it can keep the mind locked in cycles of rumination, avoidance, and hyper-awareness of what might go wrong. This is why negativity bias feels so persistent and so difficult to override. You are not just fighting a habit, you are working against the very structure of a brain designed to keep you safe, even at the expense of your peace. To understand how deep this design goes, we need to look at how the brain processes emotional experiences over time. Once a negative event is stored, the brain does not simply leave it untouched in memory. Each time you recall it, your brain partially reconstructs the memory, reinforcing the emotional charge. This is why certain moments from years ago can still feel raw. The act of remembering is also an act of strengthening the memory, making it even easier to recall the next time. This is not an accident. It is an adaptive process that evolved to make sure important warnings are never lost. The prefrontal cortex, the part of the brain associated with decision-making and rational thinking, does play a role in moderating this effect. However, when emotional intensity is high, the amygdala's influence often overrides the prefrontal cortex's balancing function. This is why you might find yourself reacting strongly to something even when you know, logically, that it is not a real threat. Logic does not always win against survival programming. The system was built to keep you alive first and to be reasonable second. From an evolutionary standpoint, this bias made sense. It was better to overreact to a false alarm than to miss a real danger. The cost of unnecessary fear was small compared to the cost of ignoring a genuine threat. Over thousands of years, this overreaction became a stable part of our psychological makeup. The result is a brain that naturally leans toward caution, suspicion, and heightened alertness when faced with anything remotely negative. In modern society, this can lead to distorted perspectives. A disagreement with a coworker might feel like a significant threat to your professional stability. A single piece of criticism might outweigh dozens of positive comments in your mind. Even minor inconveniences can trigger an outsized reaction if they resemble a pattern of negative experiences you have stored. In all these cases, the survival blueprint is at work, magnifying the potential danger far beyond its actual size. This is also why attempts to fight negativity bias through willpower alone often fail. You are not merely trying to change a thought pattern. You are challenging a network of biological systems, chemical responses, and neural pathways that have been refined over millions of years. The brain is stubborn in protecting this mechanism because it interprets it as a matter of life and death. It does not understand that the threats you face today are often social, emotional, or symbolic, rather than physically lethal. The uncomfortable reality is that this ancient design, which once gave our species an advantage, can now hold us back. It can limit our willingness to take chances, to trust others, or to embrace change. It can turn life into a constant search for what might harm us, rather than what might help us. Even when surrounded by safety, your brain can keep you living as if danger is always close. The survival blueprint of the brain is not something you can erase. It is part of the human condition. It can, however, be understood, and in understanding it, you begin to see how much of your mental energy is devoted not to living fully, but to scanning for the worst that could happen. This truth is what makes negativity bias such a powerful force in both individual lives and collective human behavior. If the survival blueprint explains why negativity bias exists, the prison of daily perception shows how it operates in the modern world. The bias is not an occasional distortion that appears only in moments of crisis. It is an active filter that colors nearly every interaction, every judgment, and every recollection you experience. You carry it with you from the moment you wake until the moment you close your eyes at night, often without realizing how much it is influencing what you see as reality. Consider a simple example. You receive feedback at work. Most of it is positive, acknowledging your skills, your reliability, and your contributions. Yet there is a single comment about an area you could improve. That single remark takes root. Throughout the day, you think about it more than the praise you received. By the evening, the positive feedback feels like background noise, while the one negative comment plays over in your mind, shaping your mood and your self-perception. This is negativity bias in action. It is not just that you remember the negative more vividly, it is that the negative has the power to define the entire experience. This same effect appears in relationships. Imagine spending time with someone you care about, sharing laughter, and enjoying good conversation. Yet, during that time, they make one remark that feels critical or dismissive. Hours later, the warmth of the interaction fades, replaced by the sharp memory of that single moment. Your mind elevates it, not because you want to, but because the ancient survival system inside you treats criticism or rejection as a form of threat. The emotional weight given to that moment is disproportionate, but the brain does not measure proportion, it measures potential danger. the bias also shapes how we view ourselves. Many people carry vivid memories of times they embarrassed themselves, failed publicly, or were humiliated, while struggling to recall moments when they acted with courage, kindness, or skill. Over time, this imbalance builds a distorted self-image. You might believe you are clumsy because you recall the times you stumbled, while forgetting the hundreds of times you walked without incident. You might believe you are socially awkward because you remember the one awkward conversation more clearly than the many smooth interactions you have had. In dark psychology, this imbalance is particularly concerning because it creates a vulnerability that can be exploited. A person who knows your mind, gives more weight to the negative, can easily influence you by selectively providing negative feedback, withholding positive reinforcement, or subtly reminding you of past mistakes. The result is a deepening of self-doubt, even when the actual evidence of your worth or competence is strong. In this way, negativity bias becomes not just a mental habit, but a tool for manipulation. When left unchecked, this bias can also distort your view of the world. News headlines, social media posts, and conversations often focus on problems, dangers, and conflicts. Because your brain is more responsive to negative information, you might start to believe that danger is everywhere, that people are less trustworthy than they are, or that the world is steadily getting worse, even when data shows improvements in many areas. This perception shapes your decisions, your willingness to take risks, and even your openness to new ideas. The prison of daily perception is not made of physical walls, yet it confines the way you think, feel, and act. It traps you in a loop where your attention, your memory, and your interpretation of events are drawn again and again toward what is wrong, what is broken, and what could harm you. One of the most difficult aspects of this prison is that it feels natural. You do not wake up each day believing you are distorting reality. You believe you are seeing things as they are. Yet the mind's internal spotlight is fixed on the negative, illuminating every flaw, every threat, and every imperfection, while leaving large areas of truth in the shadows. This is why it is so easy for negativity bias to shape your worldview without resistance. The bias does not announce itself. It works quietly, embedding itself in the way you notice, interpret, and remember events. This constant focus on what is wrong can influence the choices you make, without you realizing the connection. A person who has been criticized at work may hesitate to volunteer for new projects, fearing the possibility of another critical remark. Someone who has been betrayed in a relationship may avoid emotional closeness, believing it will protect them from future harm. Over time, avoidance becomes a default response, not because opportunities are genuinely dangerous, but because the mind treats all perceived risk as if it were life-threatening. From a psychological perspective, this pattern feeds into cycles of confirmation. When you expect negative outcomes, you become more likely to notice evidence that supports your expectation. If you believe that people cannot be trusted, every act of dishonesty will stand out sharply, while acts of kindness or integrity may go unnoticed or be dismissed as exceptions. This selective attention reinforces your original belief, creating a self-sustaining loop. The longer the loop runs, the more it becomes part of your identity and the harder it is to challenge. In the context of dark psychology, this is where the prison becomes most dangerous. People or systems that understand this loop can feed it intentionally. By controlling the flow of negative information, they can strengthen your belief in a certain danger, threat, or limitation, while making you feel as though you have reached this conclusion on your own. This makes the influence harder to detect and even harder to resist. It is a form of control that works not by adding chains, but by ensuring you never step outside the boundaries you have been conditioned to believe exist. The emotional cost of this prison is significant. Living in a state of heightened sensitivity to negative information increases stress levels, drains mental energy, and can lead to chronic anxiety or depression. It also limits joy, because joy requires a willingness to notice, appreciate, and hold on to what is good. When your mental spotlight is always moving toward the worst, the good is often overlooked before it can take root in memory. The most troubling fact is that this prison is self-reinforcing. The more time you spend focusing on what is wrong, the more your brain becomes conditioned to look for it, and the more convinced you become that this is the true state of the world. This is why negativity bias is not only a psychological phenomenon, but also a lived reality that shapes entire lifetimes. In the natural world of our ancestors, negativity bias evolved as a survival tool, a way to keep danger at the forefront of awareness. In the modern world, it has become something more calculated. The bias still exists as a built-in feature of the human brain, but it is no longer just an unconscious process. It has been studied, understood, and in many cases, deliberately exploited. This is where dark psychology reveals one of its most disturbing realities: the tendency of human systems to amplify and weaponize what the brain is already predisposed to do. You live in an environment where your attention is one of the most valuable commodities. Entire industries are built on capturing and holding it for as long as possible. The fastest way to do that is not to make you feel good, but to make you feel uneasy, angry, or afraid. These emotions are gripping because they match the brain's evolutionary programming. Once triggered, they create a state of heightened vigilance. The negative message stays with you longer, is shared more often, and is more likely to influence your decisions. This is why fear-based headlines dominate the news cycle, why conflict draws more views on social media, and why marketing campaigns sometimes focus on what you could lose rather than what you could gain. When a news outlet reports a rare but frightening event, it can cause people to overestimate its frequency and significance. This is called the availability heuristic, and it works in perfect harmony with negativity bias. The mind interprets the vividness of the memory as evidence that the event is common or likely, even when statistics say otherwise. For example, a single widely reported violent crime can lead entire communities to feel unsafe, regardless of actual crime rates. Once planted, the fear lingers because the mind keeps retrieving it, keeping the perception of danger alive. Social media intensifies this effect through algorithmic design. Platforms track which content you engage with, and if negative content keeps your attention longer, the system will show you more of it. The cycle becomes self-perpetuating. You are presented with more negative material, you engage with it, and the platform responds by delivering even more. Over time, your feed can become heavily skewed toward content that makes you feel alarmed, angry, or hopeless. This is not simply a byproduct of technology. It is the result of systems learning how to interact with the brain's natural tendencies and using those tendencies to increase engagement. In dark psychology, this is known as stimulus control, a method of shaping perception and behavior by controlling the type and intensity of input a person receives. It is most effective when the person believes they are in full control of their choices. In reality, when your environment continually supplies you with high-intensity negative information, your attention narrows, your worldview becomes darker, and your decisions begin to align with the narrative you are repeatedly shown. What makes this particularly dangerous is that the amplification is often subtle. You may not notice the gradual increase in negative content or the way it shifts your mood and thinking over weeks or months. This engineered environment can leave you feeling more anxious, more distrustful, and more certain that the world is far worse than it actually is. One of the most striking aspects of this manipulation is how easily it blends into the background of daily life. You might believe that you are simply reacting to the reality around you, when in fact you are reacting to a carefully curated set of inputs designed to activate your negativity bias. The more frequently these triggers are delivered, the more the mind's natural balance between positive and negative perception is disrupted. Eventually, the negative is not just more memorable, it becomes the dominant lens through which you interpret almost everything. The same principle applies in politics and advertising. Campaigns often focus less on inspiring voters and more on warning them about potential dangers if the opponent wins. Businesses sometimes highlight the problems you will face if you do not use their product or service, rather than the benefits you might gain from using it. These approaches work because they align perfectly with the brain's tendency to prioritize avoiding loss over seeking gain. This is known in psychology as loss aversion, and when combined with negativity bias, it becomes a highly persuasive force. Entertainment media also contributes to this amplification. Films, television, and even fictional stories often rely on conflict, danger, and betrayal to maintain engagement. While this is a natural element of storytelling, the saturation of negative themes across multiple forms of media reinforces a sense of constant threat. The brain does not always separate fictional danger from real danger at the emotional level. Emotional reactions can be triggered even when the mind knows the events are not real, and those emotional states can influence mood long after the story ends. In the digital era, the speed at which information spreads magnifies the effect. A single alarming post can be shared thousands of times within minutes, reaching millions of people before any verification takes place. The human brain is more likely to remember the alarming claim than the correction that follows later. This creates an environment where fear and outrage travel faster and last longer than truth or resolution. In such an environment, negativity bias does not just persist, it thrives. From a dark psychology standpoint, this is a form of emotional conditioning. By repeatedly pairing certain topics, groups, or ideas with negative emotions, it is possible to create lasting associations in the public mind. These associations influence how people vote, what they buy, and even how they interact with one another. The most effective manipulation is not the one that forces you to think a certain way. It is the one that makes you believe you arrived at the conclusion on your own. The emotional cost of this engineered amplification is considerable. People living in a constant state of alertness to potential threats experience higher stress levels, disrupted sleep patterns, and a reduced capacity for creative or strategic thinking. Over time, this can erode mental health, deepen social divisions, and reduce the willingness to cooperate or trust. The mind, originally shaped to protect life, becomes a tool that can be guided toward fear, suspicion, and hostility. This is why understanding the mechanics of this amplification is not just an academic exercise, it is a necessary step in protecting your mental clarity in a world where your natural biases can be turned into levers of control. Every thought, every memory, and every interpretation you hold carries a mental cost. The brain does not process information without consequence. When negativity bias dominates perception, the cost is higher than most people realize. It is not simply an issue of remembering the unpleasant more than the pleasant. It is about the way the bias diverts mental resources, consumes emotional energy, and shapes the overall architecture of your thinking. One of the most immediate costs is the strain placed on attention. The mind has a limited capacity for focus at any given moment. When negative information takes priority, it pushes aside other forms of input, including neutral or positive experiences. Over time, this selective focus can narrow the range of what you notice. You may find yourself dwelling on small inconveniences, replaying past mistakes, or anticipating problems before they occur, all while overlooking opportunities or moments of genuine connection. This narrowing of awareness is not accidental. It is the brain prioritizing what it perceives as survival-relevant material, even when the stakes are far lower than life or death. The emotional toll is equally significant. Prolonged attention to negative experiences increases the release of stress hormones, such as cortisol. Elevated cortisol levels over time are associated with anxiety, depression, and impaired cognitive function. You might notice difficulty concentrating, making decisions, or remembering important details. These are not signs of weakness. They are signs that your brain is operating under a persistent state of perceived threat. The more the threat response is triggered, the more the brain stays locked in patterns of vigilance, leaving less mental energy for creativity, problem-solving, and long-term planning. Another cost comes in the form of memory distortion. When the mind recalls negative events more vividly and more often, those memories can become exaggerated, details may shift, and the emotional intensity may increase with each recollection. This process, known as memory reconsolidation, means that the memory is not a fixed record, but a living construct that can grow more powerful over time. The result is that the events may seem worse than they were, reinforcing the sense of danger and further embedding the bias. In dark psychology, the concept of cognitive load becomes central here. Cognitive load refers to the total amount of mental effort being used at a given time. When negativity bias increases cognitive load with repeated cycles of rumination and threat monitoring, it leaves fewer resources available for rational analysis and critical thinking. This makes people more susceptible to persuasion, manipulation, and emotional influence. In other words, the more taxed your mental system is by persistent negativity, the easier it becomes for external forces to guide your thinking without your full awareness. Perhaps the most insidious cost is the gradual reshaping of identity. If your mind spends more time and energy holding on to what has hurt you than on what has strengthened you, then over the years your self-image begins to tilt toward fragility, mistrust, or defensiveness. This does not happen overnight. It happens slowly, almost invisibly, until one day you realize that your automatic reactions, your beliefs about others, and even your expectations for the future have been molded by the constant presence of negative recall. When we look deeper at how negativity bias alters daily functioning, we see that it does not simply affect what you think about. It changes how you think. Under the constant influence of negative recall, the brain begins to favor short-term, defensive thinking over long-term, strategic reasoning. This shift is not a matter of conscious choice. It is the brain's way of ensuring immediate safety by preparing for potential threats, even if those threats are unlikely or imagined. While this may have been adaptive in a dangerous environment, it becomes a liability in modern life, where growth and success often require calculated risk, trust, and openness to uncertainty. This defensive thinking pattern can influence decision-making in subtle but damaging ways. You may find yourself avoiding opportunities because you focus more on what could go wrong than on what could go right. Even when presented with strong evidence that a choice is safe or beneficial, the weight of past negative experiences can tip the balance toward caution or withdrawal. Over time, this tendency can lead to missed opportunities, stalled progress, and a persistent feeling that life is passing you by. The emotional consequences deepen alongside the cognitive ones. Living in a state of high alert drains resilience. Emotional recovery from setbacks becomes slower, and the threshold for stress becomes lower. This means that situations which might once have felt manageable can now feel overwhelming. Chronic exposure to negativity also makes it harder to regulate mood. You may find yourself reacting more strongly to small frustrations or struggling to find joy in experiences that once brought you satisfaction. In dark psychology, this is recognized as a weakening of psychological defenses. When mental and emotional resources are depleted, the mind is less able to resist external influence. Whether it is through targeted messaging, interpersonal manipulation, or broader societal narratives, the combination of high cognitive load and low emotional resilience makes it easier for others to direct your perceptions and behavior. This is not about intelligence or willpower. It is about the limits of a system that was not designed for the constant bombardment of high-intensity negative input that modern life delivers. There is also a social cost. When your mind is tuned toward the negative, your interactions with others are colored by suspicion, defensiveness, or a readiness to interpret ambiguous signals as threats. This can erode trust, strain relationships, and create distance between you and those around you. Over time, the lack of positive reinforcement from social connections can further reinforce the bias, creating a self-reinforcing cycle that is difficult to break. Perhaps the most sobering fact is that these costs are often invisible until they have been accumulating for years. The changes in thought patterns, emotional responses, and relationships happen gradually. By the time they are fully recognized, they may feel like an unchangeable part of who you are. This is why understanding negativity bias is not merely about self-awareness. It is about recognizing that the mind's tendency to hold on to the worst is not free. It demands payment in focus, in emotional stability, in relationships, and ultimately in the quality of life itself. It may sound strange to say that the mind finds any kind of reward in pain, yet when we study negativity bias closely, we find that this is not entirely untrue. Pain, especially emotional pain, is unpleasant, but it is also familiar. Familiarity can feel safer than uncertainty, even when what is familiar is harmful. This paradox sits at the heart of why negative memories are so persistent and why the mind resists letting them go. In the framework of dark psychology, this is one of the more unsettling truths. The mind can become attached to what hurts it, not because it enjoys suffering, but because it finds stability in predictability. From a purely psychological standpoint, the mind seeks patterns. Patterns help us navigate life more efficiently by allowing us to predict outcomes. When a negative event occurs, the mind does not simply record it as an isolated incident. It searches for meaning, creates associations, and looks for signs that might warn of its recurrence. Over time, these warnings become part of your mental landscape. They are like familiar landmarks, guiding your decisions and reactions. Even if those landmarks are tied to painful experiences, they serve a purpose. They make the future feel more knowable. This is where the hidden reward begins to emerge. A predictable pain feels less threatening than an unknown risk. You might avoid certain opportunities not because you are certain they will harm you, but because they fall outside the boundaries of what you know. If you have been hurt in relationships, the mind may focus on that hurt as a guiding reference, even at the cost of missing out on healthy connections. The pain becomes a frame of reference that ironically offers a sense of control. Neurologically, the repetition of recalling negative experiences reinforces neural pathways associated with those memories. This means that the more often you think about a painful event, the more accessible it becomes, and the easier it is to retrieve in the future. This ease of access can give the illusion of preparedness. The mind tells itself that by keeping the pain close, it is staying ready for whatever might come. In reality, this readiness often comes at the expense of openness, creativity, and trust. In dark psychology, this tendency can be exploited by creating environments where negative emotions are consistently reinforced. When a person becomes accustomed to a certain level of tension, criticism, or fear, they may unconsciously seek it out, not because they want to feel bad, but because it has become the emotional baseline. This can happen in personal relationships, in workplaces, or even through media consumption. If calm or positivity feels unfamiliar, it can be rejected or mistrusted, while negativity feels oddly comfortable. This is why breaking free from the grip of negativity bias is not simply a matter of replacing negative thoughts with positive ones. It involves challenging the deeper attachment to what is known, even when it is harmful. Pain that has been part of your life for years is not just a memory, it is a reference point, a structure your mind has built into its understanding of the world. Removing it can feel like dismantling part of your identity, and that is not something the mind does easily. To truly understand why this hidden reward holds such power, we need to examine the psychological comfort that predictability provides. The human mind evolved in a world where uncertainty could mean danger. In that environment, even unpleasant familiarity was safer than the unknown. This survival logic persists today, even though the dangers we face are often emotional or social rather than physical. When you know the shape of your pain, you can anticipate its arrival, prepare for its impact, and feel a degree of control over it. The unknown offers no such control. This is why people sometimes remain in environments, relationships, or habits that consistently bring them distress. The mind has calculated at a subconscious level that the cost of staying is less than the cost of venturing into unfamiliar territory. In doing so, it reinforces the neural and emotional pathways that make negative recall so strong. Every time the pain is revisited, whether intentionally or not, it becomes more embedded, more familiar, and more likely to be carried forward into future decisions. There is also an identity component to this attachment. Over time, repeated negative experiences can become part of the story you tell yourself about who you are. If you have lived through betrayal, failure, or humiliation, those events can begin to shape the way you describe yourself to others and the way you silently define yourself. The memory is no longer just something that happened. It becomes part of the foundation of your personal narrative. Removing it would not only mean letting go of the pain, but also rewriting the way you understand your own life. In dark psychology, this aspect of identity is a point of potential manipulation. When someone understands that you are anchored to certain painful experiences, they can position themselves as the one who validates that identity, reinforces it, or uses it to influence your choices. By affirming the reality of your pain, even in subtle ways, they can deepen your reliance on them for understanding and validation. This creates a cycle where the pain, rather than being challenged, is maintained because it strengthens the connection between you and the one who acknowledges it. Breaking free from this hidden reward requires more than intellectual understanding. It demands a willingness to step into emotional uncertainty, to allow for the possibility that life can be navigated without the constant presence of familiar suffering. This is not easy. The absence of pain does not automatically feel like peace. At first, it can feel like emptiness. The mind, used to a background noise of caution and distress, may search for it, just as a person in a silent room notices the absence of sound. The most difficult truth is that this hidden reward is not something you consciously choose. It is a byproduct of a system designed to protect you, a system that does not distinguish between survival in the wilderness and survival in the modern world. And as long as the mind sees value in holding on to the worst, it will find reasons to keep that pain close, even at the expense of the life you could be living. When we speak about negativity bias in a purely scientific context, we can measure its impact in terms of brain activity, cognitive load, and behavioral patterns. But there is another layer, one that philosophy has wrestled with for centuries. Human beings are not only biological systems responding to stimuli, we are also meaning-making creatures. Every memory, whether pleasant or painful, exists within a larger narrative about life, purpose, and truth. This is where the weight of negativity moves beyond the psychological and becomes philosophical. Throughout history, many philosophical traditions have recognized the mind's tendency to give greater weight to suffering. In Stoic thought, philosophers such as Seneca and Epictetus urged people to anticipate misfortune, not out of pessimism, but as a way to remain prepared for life's inevitable hardships. This was a conscious engagement with the very same bias we now understand through neuroscience. The Stoics believed that suffering could be endured and even transcended if it was met with understanding and discipline. Yet they also acknowledged that the shadow of misfortune never truly leaves the human mind. In existential philosophy, the focus shifts toward the search for meaning in the face of suffering. Thinkers like Søren Kierkegaard and Jean-Paul Sartre explored the tension between freedom and the burdens of existence, noting that moments of despair often feel more real than moments of joy. Joy can feel fleeting, light and fragile, while despair carries a density that seems to anchor it in the mind. This mirrors what psychology now explains as negativity bias. The heavier weight given to the bad is not merely emotional, but structural. There is also a moral dimension to this bias. If the mind naturally holds on to the worst, it may shape our sense of justice, responsibility, and morality in ways we do not consciously recognize. Many ethical frameworks focus heavily on the prevention of harm, sometimes even more than the promotion of good. This emphasis reflects the underlying truth that avoiding the negative often feels more urgent than achieving the positive. In public policy, in personal relationships, and in moral decision-making, the avoidance of harm tends to outweigh the pursuit of benefit. From a dark psychology perspective, this moral weighting can be exploited. By framing an issue in terms of preventing disaster rather than creating improvement, leaders, influencers, and institutions can more easily gain support. People are more likely to act when told that inaction will lead to harm than when told that action will bring gain. This is not a flaw of intelligence. It is a predictable pattern of human motivation, tied directly to how the mind processes negative versus positive information. The philosophical weight of negativity also raises the question of truth. If our perception is inherently biased toward the worst, can we ever see reality clearly? Are we, in some sense, trapped in a distorted view of the world that emphasizes danger beyond its actual proportion? These are not just academic questions. They reach into how we live day to day, how we make choices, and how we interpret the events that shape our lives. One of the more unsettling implications of negativity bias is that it may not only be an obstacle to truth, but in some ways a form of truth-seeking. Negative information often feels more authentic than positive information because it is harder to dismiss as fantasy. When someone tells you good news, there is a natural skepticism that asks whether it is exaggerated or incomplete. Yet when someone tells you something bad, you are more inclined to believe it, even without evidence. This tendency, which philosophy has long recognized, suggests that we may associate the negative with a kind of raw honesty about the human condition. In existential and phenomenological thought, this preference for the negative can be seen as an acknowledgement of life's fragility. Joy is fragile, peace is fragile, but pain and loss feel permanent, unshakable. That permanence gives them weight in our consciousness. It is why we often measure our lives not only by our happiest moments, but also by our most difficult trials. In some ways, the mind treats those trials as the real markers of who we are and what we have endured. There is also a paradox here. While negativity can distort our perception, it can also deepen our understanding of reality. Without an awareness of danger, suffering, and failure, we cannot fully appreciate safety, joy, or success. The problem lies not in recognizing the negative, but in the imbalance that comes when the negative dominates our thinking. This imbalance narrows the scope of our awareness until we live in a reality that feels darker than it truly is. From a dark psychology angle, understanding this philosophical weight provides a powerful lever for influence. If people already see the negative as more real, then crafting messages that appeal to this perception can bypass skepticism and resistance. The listener does not have to be persuaded that something bad could happen. They are already predisposed to believe it. This is why warnings, threats, and cautionary narratives can be so compelling and so difficult to challenge once they take hold. Philosophically, this raises the question of whether liberation from negativity bias is even desirable. To remove or significantly reduce it might create a more optimistic view of life, but could it also make us less grounded, less prepared, or less motivated to act against genuine threats? Many philosophical traditions suggest that wisdom lies not in eliminating awareness of suffering, but in learning how to carry it without letting it govern every decision. This requires an ongoing balance between acknowledging the reality of pain and refusing to let it define the entirety of life. The lasting truth is that negativity holds weight because it reflects something real about existence. Life does contain loss, injustice, and danger, and the mind's readiness to focus on these is part of its way of respecting that truth. Yet when that weight becomes too heavy, it can crush perspective, leaving little room for the possibilities that exist beyond the shadows. The challenge is not to deny the weight, but to ensure that it does not anchor us so deeply in the worst that we cannot move toward the best. In a world filled with self-help messages and motivational slogans, it is easy to believe that positive thinking is the key to freedom from negativity bias. We are told that if we focus on the good, repeat affirmations, and surround ourselves with uplifting influences, we can train the mind to see the brighter side of life. While these practices can be beneficial, they rarely deliver the deep, lasting change they promise. This is because the roots of negativity bias run far deeper than surface-level thought patterns. They are embedded in the brain's survival architecture, and no amount of slogans can rewrite that blueprint overnight. Positive thinking often fails to override the bias because it does not address the mechanisms that keep negative memories and perceptions active. A statement like "I am confident" can feel good in the moment, but if the mind has stored years of memories tied to failure or rejection, those memories will continue to carry more weight than a few moments of verbal encouragement. The brain's default is to treat the negative as urgent and the positive as optional, This means that positive messages must work much harder to gain even a fraction of the influence that negative experiences already have. This is not to say that optimism is pointless. In fact, cultivating a balanced and realistic form of optimism can help reduce the influence of negativity bias over time. The problem lies in believing that positivity alone equals freedom. In reality, this belief can create an illusion of control that leaves people unprepared for how persistent and automatic the bias truly is. When the bias reasserts itself, as it inevitably will, the individual may feel as though they have failed at positive thinking, when in fact they were working against a deeply rooted cognitive process from the start. From a dark psychology perspective, this illusion of positive freedom can also be used to manipulate. If someone believes that they should be able to overcome their negativity entirely through willpower, they may blame themselves when they cannot. This self-blame makes them more vulnerable to external solutions that promise quick fixes. Whether it is a product, a program, or an ideology, the offer to finally free them from negativity can become highly appealing, especially if it is framed as the missing piece they have been lacking. The emotional cost of this illusion is significant. When people believe they have the tools to escape the bias, but find themselves slipping back into old patterns, they may experience a deeper sense of hopelessness than before. The thought becomes not only, "I feel negative, but I cannot escape it, even when I try." This belief can lead to disengagement, where the individual stops making efforts to challenge the bias altogether, assuming that it is an unchangeable part of who they are. The truth is that negativity bias cannot be erased. It can be understood, managed, and counterbalanced, but it will always be part of the mind's operating system. Positive thinking, while valuable, is only one tool in a much larger set of strategies needed to navigate this reality. Believing otherwise risks mistaking temporary relief for lasting freedom, and that mistake can keep the bias firmly in place. To see why the illusion of positive freedom is so persistent, we must examine how the brain processes reinforcement. Negative experiences are reinforced by strong emotional responses and the release of stress hormones, which strengthen the memory and make it easier to recall. Positive experiences, on the other hand, often generate less physiological arousal, meaning they fade more quickly unless they are intentionally reinforced through repetition and emotional engagement. This is why you might remember an embarrassing mistake from years ago in vivid detail, yet struggle to recall a compliment you received last week. In modern culture, this imbalance is often overlooked. The message of "just think positive" is simple, appealing, and easy to sell, but it ignores the fact that the brain is not neutral in how it treats experiences. Trying to overwrite deeply embedded negative memories with surface-level positivity is like trying to paint over a cracked wall without repairing the structure underneath. The cracks may be hidden for a while, but eventually they will show through again. From a dark psychology angle, the illusion becomes a powerful marketing tool. When people believe they can and should be free from negativity through positivity alone, they may buy into endless cycles of self-improvement products, courses, or systems that promise lasting transformation but never deliver it. The failure to achieve permanent change is not because the individual is incapable, but because the expectation itself is unrealistic. This keeps them returning for the next promised solution, always chasing a state of mind that does not naturally exist. There is also a deeper philosophical element to consider. If we were to remove negativity bias entirely, would we still be fully human in the way we understand ourselves today? Much of human art, literature, and even progress is driven by our awareness of difficulty, loss, and imperfection. The capacity to hold negative truths alongside positive possibilities may be part of what gives our lives depth and meaning. In this sense, the idea of total freedom from negativity might not only be impossible, but undesirable. This is not an argument against pursuing a more balanced mind. It is a reminder that balance is different from eradication. Real freedom is not found in silencing the negative entirely, but in learning to prevent it from dominating every thought and choice. This requires acknowledging the bias without letting it set the direction of your life. It is a slow, deliberate process that demands self-awareness, critical thinking, and resilience, rather than a quick mental adjustment. The illusion of positive freedom is compelling because it offers certainty, and certainty feels safe. But certainty can also be a trap, especially when it blinds us to the complexity of how the mind works. The reality is that negativity bias will always have a place in human thought. The measure of our freedom lies not in escaping it, but in knowing when to listen to its warnings and when to move forward despite them. We have walked through the layers of negativity bias, from its ancient survival blueprint to its modern exploitation. Through dark psychology, we have seen how it shapes our perception, narrows our attention, drains our energy, and alters the way we see ourselves and the world. Along the way, we have confronted uncomfortable truths. The bias is not a glitch, not a weakness, and not simply about emotional pain. It is an integral part of how the human mind operates, designed to protect, but also capable of limiting. By now, you may feel that you know this force more intimately. You can recognize it in the way a single criticism eclipses 100 compliments, in how a memory of failure refuses to fade, in how the news story that frightened you last week still lingers in your thoughts. You can see it in your hesitation before trying something new, in the way you scan for signs of trouble even when you are safe, and in the subtle but steady pull toward the familiar discomfort of old pain. Yet, knowing all of this does not automatically free you from its influence. Awareness is the first step, but it is not the last. The bias will not dissolve simply because you can name it. It is woven into your perception in ways that operate below the level of conscious thought. This is why, even as you try to shift your focus toward the positive, the negative will often return with greater force. That is not a failure of willpower. It is the mind doing exactly what it was designed to do. There is a temptation to ask for the answer, the cure, the method that will strip this bias away for good. But perhaps that is the wrong question. If this bias is part of the human condition, then the choice is not whether we can erase it, but how we will live with it. Will we allow it to be the architect of our reality, or will we use our awareness to decide when it is guiding us and when it is misleading us? In truth, the work is ongoing. There is no moment when you will be entirely free from the pull toward the worst. There will always be another memory that resurfaces unexpectedly, another criticism that feels sharper than it should, another fear that grows larger than the facts allow. What changes is not the presence of the bias, but your relationship with it. You can notice its influence without surrendering to it completely. You can recognize when it is keeping you safe and when it is keeping you small. This is not easy work. It requires vigilance without paranoia, self-awareness without self-criticism. It means choosing, over and over, to seek a fuller picture of reality, rather than accepting the narrow view the bias offers. Sometimes that will mean deliberately recalling the good with the same effort that your mind uses to recall the bad. Other times it will mean stepping into opportunities that feel uncomfortable simply because the discomfort is rooted in old fears rather than current danger. The choice is yours, and it will be yours every day for as long as you live. There is no final victory over negativity bias, but there can be a lifetime of smaller victories. Moments when you see clearly enough to take a step forward instead of back. Moments when you hold on to what is good long enough for it to leave a lasting mark. If this conversation has given you something to think about, I invite you to pass it on. Share it with someone who may be living under the weight of this bias without knowing its name. Let them see that the mind's grip on the worst is not a personal failing, but a shared human reality. And if you want to keep exploring the truths that live in the darker corners of psychology, you can join me for the next discussion. I will not tell you what it will be about yet, but it will reveal another piece of the hidden machinery that shapes how we think, feel, and act. The unfinished ending is this: the bias will remain. The world will still offer both danger and beauty, and the mind will still tilt toward remembering the danger. What you do with that knowledge, and how you choose to live with it, will be the measure of the life you build from here.